Welcome to Motivation Station Podcast, the hottest motivation show in your suburbs. Do you feel the daily routine is catching up and you need an extra dose of positivity? No more blue days. We will share how to rewind the time, live a happier life without stress or negativity. Are you a champion of your game? Let's go to Actionville. Introducing a woman who believes happiness is a direction and not a place, the host of Motivation Station Podcast, Tatiana D. She's on fire.
Hello to everyone who found their way to this podcast. As always, I'm happy to have you here. Happy to be able to share with you my thoughts and to do my best to cheer you on. Well, if anything, we've learned in 2021 that we still live in a very turbulent times, and our entire planet is still ravaged by this seemingly never-ending COVID. Well, we're not going to be talking about that. However, each decade has its own marks and significance. And today, we're going to dive into the Middle East region and hear the story from a woman who saw the face of war and its unthinkable devastation firsthand. Growing up in the war-torn Lebanon, she survived, became an international journalist and analyst, an award winner of the Dag Hammarskjold United Nations Scholarship. If you're here to hear her story, then you're definitely in the right place and at the right time. Let's welcome Suha Amer. She is an international journalist who was born and raised in Lebanon. She began her journey as a journalist in 1992, survived 3 decades of civil war and 3 invasions of foreign forces to her home country. Suha lost many loved ones during these wars, have been subject to many traumatic events that no child, teen, or adult should ever go through. And yet, here she is, a war survivor who persevered, earned a bachelor degree in journalism, a paralegal, environmental activist, and an avid peace activist in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She also is an advocate for enhanced gun laws, and last but by any means not the least, soon to be a blogger. Suha is absolute embodiment of a strong, peaceful spirit and absolutely unrestricted positivity. Suha, I am truly happy to have you here. Welcome to the show. Let's begin.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations on your...
When I announced this episode on the Facebook, there was quite a few questions from several followers and readers, which I will address at the later time. But right now, I just would like to start with one simple but yet loaded question. Through all the times and the continents, any war is absolutely always ugly and always is accompanied by death, hurt, and tears. And yet here you are, Suha, one of the most upbeat, and cheerful ladies I've ever have privilege to know. What exactly keeps you going?
A lot of things, but mainly is because there is no other way for me to go except forward. My years during the war were unthinkable and unimaginable. And I don't think any kid, teenager, or even an adult should. There is no other way for me to go backwards because I already tried that and I don't want to go through with it. And also, I don't want others to go through what I did go through.
What helped Suha to survive the war and still keep the positive outlook and the spirit?
However, it was a very fascinating combination of being blessed with loving parents.
You came from the war zone. You're here being positive, raising your own family. But yet, as much as we don't want to go back, sometimes I'd like to understand a few things. And pretty much I'm sure that other listeners may have the same questions as to what happened in your country and why it was torn with many wars. Can you please shed some light about what led to all these wars in your home country to help listeners to understand where are you coming from?
Well, as you said, it's mainly very confusing. It was very confusing to me as a kid. I was 8 years old when I was aware that obviously something was very wrong. For a kid of that age to be moving from one place to another, from one shelter to another, and the sound of horrible bombardment, artillery, heavy artillery, it made me notice that something was very wrong, especially that even though that my parents tried their best to kind of like make us living in a very normal kind of way, like other kids in my age and my siblings' age in other countries, they were successful, but not most of the time, unfortunately. Not that they have tried, but their circumstances did not help them to accomplish that, So going back to your question is, okay, Lebanon had its independence from the French mandate in 1942. By then, the political scene was kind of chaotic and unstable to a certain extent. But by mid-70s, the power vacuum reached its tipping point. Disenfranchised minorities armed heavily and actively launched a war that was both vicious and disconcerting, to say the least. For decades, people thought it was a secular-based war, and I was one of those. All I remember was running with my parents, as I said before, from one shelter to another to find refuge from the snipers. And one would ask, and I make sure to ask my parents, what was going on? Who was fighting who in Lebanon? And why? That's precisely what the curious child back then was asking her parents, instead of asking, okay, can I go play with my bike outside? Can I go for a trip with my friends? I did not have that luxury back then. So my parents, however, did not answer my questions. They kind of like always found alibis to maneuver the conversation and evade answering directly. So this kind of like made me more curious to find out as much as possible of what's going on. And I want to know the truth. And that shaped my life at a later age when I decided to, obviously, I only have the alternative to be a journalist, to seek and to find the truth, however ugly it was, obviously. So I studied, yes, I did. After tons of work and research, I finally kind of like did find the answer. Do I like the answer? That's another issue. Let's just say that sometimes the truth is a very hard pill to swallow. To put it briefly, and after decades of war, hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, fatalities, severely injured, displaced, migrants, economic and social complete collapse of Lebanon, major mental health issues. I can only say that in all honesty, that it was war of BS, total, complete BS. To understand what happened, I'm going to go through some major points here that are going to hopefully help the listeners to understand what happened in Lebanon. In Lebanon, we had what is called a national pact since, the beginnings of the 70s, which was an informal agreement that prearranged political positions to religion sects back then. It gave the president to the Maronite minorities, Christian Maronite minorities, the prime minister to the Sunni Muslims, and the Speaker of the House, the parliamentary, House Speaker, was to the Shiite Muslims. Now, the parliament in itself was 6-5 in ratio, and the president had the upper hand in leading the country in major decisions, especially, which left the remaining Lebanese counterparts with breadcrumbs only, so to speak. The fighting which started, and it was shown to the other world that it was kind of like a religious fight, which I believed also before I became a journalist and did my work and my research. It wasn't. It was dressed as religion, but it did have other aspects.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. That's something no child or no young adult should be going through, for sure. In the light of everything, I hear how you were saying that you weren't able to go outside on the trips and be with your friends because obviously, unfortunately, you were forced to look for shelters and to survive. But how did you guys get food? Were there any stores, or I'm asking those questions because I'm just clueless, and luckily I didn't go through the horrible times you went through, so I just wanted to understand.
Well, that's a very valid question because during the war, one cannot go to work, one cannot go to school, one cannot even barely survive with bare necessities, right?
Yes.
It kind of got worse. Very small or brief periods of ceasefire between the fractions who were, fighting, like ethnic minorities, rogue militias, and all the, warlords who existed back then. They would kind of like connect one way or the other, their leaders actually, and have ceasefires, periodic ceasefires, so that people can go out, get food, buy food, whatever method they had, and obviously we survived. But there are lots of people who are less fortunate. My parents were close to being middle class, and we were okay, but others didn't have the means to provide for their families.
Suha, you spent your teen years in the war zone. These years are always crucial in forming a future adult character. What was the most horrendous experience you took from the war?
There is not one incident that had impacted me, and I still remember it like recurringly. But what I still remember mostly is as I mentioned before, because of the tensions that were growing in Lebanon back in the 70s. I just want to highlight something for the listeners to help them understand what made us go through this. There was already tensions between the Lebanese, the social, the middle class, the elitists who were governing Lebanon, and the poverty, the poor people, people who were actually breadcrumbs only, living off breadcrumbs. Well, that didn't go well until something very important happened, and that was actually the fire that combusted the whole situation, which was the Palestinians were kicked out of Palestine, and they found refuge in Lebanon. Now, here's what happened. The Lebanese kind of divided between two parts. The Muslims wanted to help the Palestinians make camps, and, because they were refugees. The Christians looked at it in another way. The Christians found this kind of like a warning, an alert for the Christians' existence in the Middle East. So they didn't agree to that. And then when this division grew, kind of like the fraction started war. And I remember there was an incident in Ain Romani, that's an area in Beirut. The PLO were having an event, and they were coming in buses passing through Christian areas, and they were armed. So the Christians did not, found that kind of like, challenging to their existence there in that area. So they attacked that bus and killed everyone in there. And that was the beginning of the war, the actual war in Lebanon. I didn't really grasp the reality of the situation like many of my peers, because I was, barely a teenager. But when I grew up and I wanted to be a journalist, and I started to be a journalist, this kind of helped me and opened a lot of closed doors to me. And I was able to access documents, usually not accessible to the public. I really did my research. It took years. But at the end, I found the bitter truth, which I was seeking. What I found is that the PLO,
PLO, it's Palestinian Liberation Organization, right? Just to clarify.
The Yasser Arafat,
okay.
Yeah. Okay, so they were kicked out of Palestine, all right? So they tried to go to Jordan. And Jordan, because they have solid social and economic situation there, the monarchy, they couldn't kind of like slither their way into the community there and do what they want to do, like a resistance. They were trying to make a foundation for their resistance against Israel, okay, to take back Palestine. That's what they're in their mind, they wanted to play that. So the Jordanians left some of the civilians there in camps for humanitarian purposes, and the military faction of the PLO were kicked out of Jordan. So they went to Egypt, they tried the same thing, and they were also kicked out of there. So because of Lebanon, who is already like the situation was already unstable, and the division was too big between the Muslims and the Christians. I don't like to really call it a religious war, because it didn't start as that. Let's say social war, okay? And because of these differences and divisions, they found actually fruit, like the land that they wanted. It's like ready for them to have what they want. And I found out that the PLO actually was ready to declare Lebanon as an alternative country to the Palestinians.
Wow, never knew that.
Yeah, one of the documents that I was shown literally says that. Can you believe it? I mean, I had the shock of my life that really you guys were kicked out of your country and you were ready to do the same to others instead of like thanking the people who hosted you and were, generous enough to host you as refugees, you were ready to kick my people out of their land. So my outlook of the Christians back then fighting against the Palestinians, PLO existence in Lebanon changed, because back then the teenager did not understand the reality on the ground. I did not understand that the Palestinians had other plans, ugly plans for my country.
And to be honest with you, world does not know about that.
No, well, this is unfortunate because Lebanon became the land for others to score. Like we had the Palestinians, we had the Israelis invasions, also we had the Syrian invasions and occupation for 3 decades of Lebanon, the Syrian army. I survived being very close to getting raped twice by Syrian army. Yeah, and now we have the Iran through Hezbollah trying to take over. Yeah, this is not covered as it should by the media here in the US. Maybe the European media is more, accessible, I guess, geographically. But I think if there is bias, let's be clear on this. There's bias in covering these things.
I hear you. During these years of chaos and destruction, were there any fun memories nonetheless? I mean, that should have been something to keep you going.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I was one of the lucky ones, me and my siblings, to have loving parents who tried their best to make amends with the very few means they had at that time. And I remember a couple of things, especially. Like one time we used to live in a building, the 4th floor in Beirut, okay? So
you were born in Beirut, right?
Yeah, I was born in my village in Baqlin and the Shuf area. So we have one house in the the mountains and one in Beirut. Okay, so we were in Beirut when the fighting used to go on, because we wanted to go to school when there's no fighting, when there's ceasefire. We used to go to school and then come back. So anyways, one time it was like early evening. So we were in the shelter. They announced on the radio that, okay, the fractions got into a ceasefire. So everybody in the building, we grabbed our stuff and we went up to the 4th floor because there's no electricity, there's no elevator. So we were carrying, all of us, and stuff, and we went up. And one of the stuff was a little mattress that we sleep on, okay, as kids. So we went on, and then the minute that my dad put his keys to the door to open the door for our apartment, the bombs were starting, coming down again. So we scrambled all the way down again to the shelter. Then a few hours later, they said, oh, we have a ceasefire now. In the middle of the night, then we scrambled back to our house. And the minute my dad again put the keys to the door, again, the bombs came down. That happened for 4 times, I swear to God, if not more. The last time then Dad, he lost it, really. He said he started cursing and screaming at the as if they were hearing him, but he just lost it. And he put me and my sister on this small, mattress. And instead of going down the stairs, he pushed us like we were sliding.
You know what?
That was really. I remember that very well. That was one of the funny
what I'm trying to say, yes, it's actually very incomprehensible for people who never grew up in a war zone. It all sounds, of course, horrible, scary, and unimaginable, and yet you find that the way to laugh how ceasefire and bombing were literally like 5-10 minutes apart. And you make light out of it, and you remember how you guys were sliding down the stairs.
Yeah,
well, I guess that's what keeps us going, right?
Exactly, the small things that keeps
To
us
laugh
going,
at small
keep you
things.
sane. That was the only option, right? We didn't have other options. Is to go forward, because the other options are scary.
Yes, indeed. Suha, I guess we have to wrap up the first part of our interview. I know that we're gonna continue it in a day or two, but at this point, I'm really happy that you were able to come and share your life story here. And as I mentioned earlier, a couple of Facebook followers, mine and yours, sent you questions. So
Really?
we're going to be addressing, yes, and they're very interesting questions. I'm not going to say a word about what they are now, of course.
Okay.
But when we're going to resume our recording, and yes, we are recording it as just for some technical reasons at this point, but we're going to address them, and I'm pretty sure that it's going to be a very interesting second part of this interview.
Thank you. I'm looking
It's nice
forward
having
to
you.
it.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.